Moscow, December 16th, 1952, late evening. In a prison cell somewhere in the labyrinthine detention system of the Soviet security apparatus, a large man sits on a wooden cot. He's 60 years old, heavyset, with the broad shoulders and thick hands of someone who spent decades in physical proximity to danger. For nearly 20 years, those hands were among the closest to Joseph Stalin, positioned between the general secretary and anyone who might wish him harm. He tasted Stalin's food. He inspected Stalin's rooms. He vetted every person who came within reach of the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. His name is Nikolai Sidorovich Vlasik, and he has just been arrested by the organization he spent his career serving, on orders from the man he spent his career protecting. In his cell, he has no way of knowing what is happening in the Kremlin, no way of knowing what Stalin is planning, no way of knowing that the elaborate political operation that destroyed his career is connected to something much larger, a final purge that Stalin is preparing, one that will dwarf even the terror of the 1930s if Stalin lives long enough to complete it. Vlasik only knows that he is here, in a cell that smells of damp concrete and old fear, stripped of his rank, his position, his access, and his purpose. The man who knew Stalin better than almost anyone alive, who had observed him across 2 decades of absolute power, who had watched him eat and sleep and rage and grieve, who had stood outside his door through the long Moscow nights, sits alone in a prison cell. And the irony is so complete, so perfectly Soviet in its terrible logic, that it almost defies description. This is his story, a story about what it means to be trusted completely and then destroyed utterly. A story about what happens when the man whose safety is your entire professional purpose turns the system against you. And a story about what one man saw across 20 years in the closest possible proximity to absolute power that history has been trying to understand ever since. Nikolai Vlasik was born in 1896 in Bobinichi, a village in what is now Belarus, to a peasant family of the kind that defined the lower depths of Tsarist Russian society. He received minimal formal education, worked as a laborer in his youth, and when the revolution came, found in it what many men of his background found, an opportunity, a path upward through an institution that valued loyalty and physical capability over birth and education. He joined the Cheka, the original Soviet secret police, in 1919 during the Civil War. His early assignments were the kind given to capable, reliable men in a new organization that needed to establish itself quickly. Guard duty, security operations, the physical protection of Soviet officials in an environment where the threat of assassination and counter-revolutionary violence was real and immediate. He was good at this work. He was physically imposing, attentive, disciplined, and possessed of the quality that security work demands above all others: the ability to be constantly present without becoming intrusive, to watch everything while appearing to watch nothing. In 1927, Vlasik was assigned to Stalin's personal security detail. Stalin had been General Secretary of the Communist Party since 1922, had been consolidating power steadily since Lenin's death in 1924, and was emerging as the dominant figure in Soviet politics. His personal security was a matter of serious organizational concern, and the men assigned to protect him were carefully selected from the most reliable personnel in the security apparatus. Vlasik's assignment to Stalin's detail was the moment that defined everything that followed in his life. He was 29 years old, a capable security officer with solid credentials, but no particular distinction. Over the next 2 decades, he would become something unique. The person who spent more continuous time in close physical proximity to Joseph Stalin than any other individual, the man who saw everything, knew everything about the daily reality of power at the summit of the Soviet state, and was required to speak of none of it. The nature of personal protection work at Stalin's level created an extraordinary intimacy of a completely impersonal kind. Vlasik didn't advise Stalin, didn't participate in political decisions, didn't belong to the intellectual or ideological world of Kremlin politics. He was responsible for the physical environment, for ensuring that spaces were secure, that food was safe, that vehicles were checked, that the perimeter between Stalin and the world was maintained and monitored at all times. This work required him to be close to Stalin constantly, to observe him in contexts that no one else observed, to know his routines, his habits, his physical states. Stalin's security requirements were genuinely complex and became more elaborate as his power and his paranoia both increased. He maintained multiple residences, the Kremlin apartments, the Kuntsevo dacha that became his primary residence after his wife's death in 1932, and several other dachas used for vacations and working retreats. Each residence required its own security apparatus, its own carefully vetted staff, its own procedures and protocols. Coordinating all of this was Vlasik's primary organizational responsibility. The food security operation was particularly elaborate. Stalin's fear of poisoning was genuine and well-founded in historical terms. Poison had been a political instrument in Russian history for centuries, and in the Soviet environment he himself had created, where assassination was a routine political tool, the concern was rational if extreme. Every item of food that reached Stalin was subject to multiple inspections and testing procedures. The kitchen staff were exhaustively vetted. The supply chain for ingredients was monitored. Vlasik oversaw this apparatus with the attention to detail that the responsibility demanded. What Vlasik observed across nearly 2 decades in this role was a portrait of Stalin that no official biography could capture. He saw Stalin at his most vulnerable, physically unwell, frightened, uncertain, consumed by the paranoia that drove so much of his political behavior. He saw him in his genuinely human moments, playing with his children in the brief periods when he engaged with them, listening to Georgian music late into the night, watching American films with a focused attention that his official schedule would never have accommodated. He saw the man beneath the myth, and what he saw was both more human and, in its way, more frightening than the official image. The relationship between a personal guard and his principal is one of the strangest human arrangements imaginable. It requires absolute loyalty without expectation of reciprocal loyalty, constant presence without intimacy, knowledge without the ability to use that knowledge for any personal purpose. Vlasik's relationship with Stalin had all of these qualities and one additional dimension. In Stalin's Soviet Union, absolute loyalty to the person you were protecting was required and assumed, while that person's loyalty to you was entirely conditional on political circumstances that had nothing to do with the quality of your service. Vlasik accumulated enormous informal power through his position. As head of Stalin's personal guard, he controlled access to Stalin, which in the Soviet system was itself a form of power. Officials who needed to see Stalin, who needed decisions made, who needed to place information in front of him, had to pass through the apparatus that Vlasik controlled. This gave Vlasik influence that went far beyond his formal role, the ability to facilitate or obstruct access, to shape what information reached Stalin and in what sequence. He also accumulated the kind of institutional knowledge about Stalin's personal life that made him dangerous in ways he may not have fully appreciated. He knew Stalin's medical history, his physical vulnerabilities, the medications he took, the conditions he managed. He knew the patterns of his behavior, when he was most rational and when most volatile, what subjects provoked his anger, what reassured him. He knew the details of his relationships with his children, particularly the complicated dynamic with his son Vasily. He knew things about the death of Stalin's wife Nadezhda in 1932 that were never publicly discussed. All of this knowledge, accumulated over 20 years of constant proximity, was both his most valuable asset and his most dangerous liability. In a system where information was power, Vlasik held more information about the most powerful man in the country than almost anyone. But information about Stalin was also the kind of information that Stalin might decide needed to be contained, particularly as his paranoia intensified in his final years. Through the 1930s and the war years, Vlasik's position seemed secure. He was promoted, his staff expanded, his organizational responsibilities grew as Stalin's security requirements became more elaborate. During the war, he managed security arrangements in conditions of genuine complexity, including Stalin's travel to the Tehran Conference in 1943, an operation that required coordinating Soviet security with foreign services in an unfamiliar environment, a genuinely difficult professional challenge that Vlasik handled successfully. He was devoted to Stalin with what appears, from the historical record, to have been genuine personal loyalty rather than merely professional obligation. He had spent 20 years protecting this man, had organized his daily life, had been present through the most significant events of the Soviet era, and had developed the kind of investment in his principal's safety and well-being that long personal service creates. When Vlasik later wrote about Stalin, the emotional register of his accounts suggests something more than professional detachment. But the world around Vlasik was changing in ways that made his position increasingly precarious. Stalin's final years were characterized by an intensifying paranoia that consumed even people who had been close to him for decades. The Doctor's plot, unveiled in January 1953, was the clearest sign that Stalin was building toward another major purge, this one targeting the medical establishment and, through it, the Jewish population of the Soviet Union more broadly. But the Doctor's plot was also connected to something else, a reorganization of Stalin's personal security that had been underway for some time. The connection between Vlasik's fall and the broader political maneuvering of Stalin's final years involves figures whose motivations are complex and not fully established in the historical record. What is documented is that in the early 1950s, Stalin became concerned about the loyalty and reliability of his personal guard apparatus. Whether this concern was genuine, based on actual security failures, or manufactured by political figures who had reasons to want Vlasik removed, is a question that historians have examined without reaching definitive consensus. Nikolai Vlasik was arrested in December 1952. The charges against him included abuse of his position, corruption, and disclosure of state secrets, the last charge being particularly significant given how much he knew. The investigation of his case proceeded through Stalin's final months, placing Vlasik in the position of being interrogated and processed by the security apparatus he had spent his career within, his fate dependent on political decisions being made in the Kremlin he could no longer access. The timing of his arrest, in the same period as the Doctor's plot and the broader political maneuvering of Stalin's last months, was not coincidental. Various historians have suggested that Vlasik's removal was connected to efforts by figures around Stalin, possibly including Beria and Malenkov, to reduce Stalin's isolation and create more control over his personal environment. By removing Vlasik and replacing him with different personnel, it became possible to reshape the information environment around Stalin in ways that served various political interests. If this analysis is correct, it represents one of the darkest ironies of Vlasik's story. The man who had spent 20 years ensuring Stalin's security may have been removed precisely because his loyalty to Stalin was too complete. Because the people maneuvering around the aging dictator needed someone in that position who was loyal to them rather than exclusively to Stalin. Vlasik's very fidelity, the quality that had defined his entire career, may have made him a target. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, while Vlasik was in custody, under investigation, stripped of everything that had given his life meaning and structure. He did not attend the funeral. He was not present at the end of the man he had spent 20 years protecting. The death of Stalin, that he had organized his entire existence around, preventing, happened while he sat in a detention facility, unable to do anything about it, learning of it through whatever information filtered into his confinement. After Stalin's death, Vlasik's case continued through the post-Stalin political landscape. He was tried, convicted on the charges against him, and sentenced to 10 years of exile in Krasnoyarsk in Siberia. The sentence was less severe than what many others had received in the same system, but it was still the destruction of a man's life and reputation. He was eventually amnestied in 1956 as part of the broader reassessment of Stalinist-era cases that followed Khrushchev's secret speech, and allowed to return to Moscow. He was partially rehabilitated in terms of his formal legal status, though never fully restored to the standing and recognition that his service might have warranted. He lived in Moscow in reduced circumstances, one of many former Soviet officials navigating the complicated landscape of post-Stalinist memory. In his later years, Vlasik wrote memoirs about his time as Stalin's guard. These memoirs, which were not published during his lifetime, but which eventually became accessible to researchers, provide a remarkable account of what it was like to live in constant proximity to absolute power. They describe Stalin's daily routines, his personal habits, his relationships with those around him, and the atmosphere of the Kremlin and the various dakhas where so much of Soviet history was made. His accounts of Stalin's final period are among the most historically significant sections of the memoirs. Vlasik describes an old man in physical and psychological decline, increasingly isolated, increasingly suspicious, making decisions in an environment of fear that surrounded him so completely that even those closest to him were terrified to give him accurate information. He describes a system that had become so thoroughly organized around Stalin's absolute authority that it had lost the capacity to function in any other mode, that everyone around Stalin was so focused on managing his perceptions and surviving his suspicions that the actual business of governing had become secondary to the business of surviving. His observations about the period immediately before his arrest, about the changes he noticed in Stalin's behavior and in the behavior of those around Stalin, about the subtle shifts in the political atmosphere that preceded the doctor's plot and his own removal, provide historical insight that is available from no other source. He was, during this period, in a position of unique observational advantage, close enough to see what was happening, but already aware, in the way that long experience with political danger creates awareness, that something was building that he might not survive. After his arrest, Vlasik later reflected on what he had seen in those final months and expressed the view that Stalin's death had not been entirely natural, that the circumstances surrounding it, the delay in medical treatment, the behavior of those around him in his final hours, had been shaped by human agency as much as by medical reality. These were sensitive observations, touching on questions that Soviet and Russian historical and political culture has never fully resolved, about what happened at Kuntsevo in early March 1953, and who bore responsibility for how those hours unfolded. Whether Vlasik's observations on these questions are the accurate perceptions of a man with unique insight, or the retrospective interpretations of someone trying to make sense of events he wasn't present for, is impossible to determine with certainty. He was in custody when Stalin died. He learned what happened through later accounts, through conversations with people who had been there, through the reconstruction of events that any historian or informed observer performs. His views on Stalin's death are significant historical testimony, but cannot be treated as eyewitness evidence. Nikolai Vlasik died in 1967 in Moscow. He had outlived Stalin by 14 years, had survived his arrest and exile, had lived to see the partial rehabilitation of his reputation and the partial acknowledgement that his service had been real and substantial. He died as a man who had been reduced from the inner circle of Soviet power to a pensioner's existence in the same city, carrying memories that most of the people around him could not have imagined and would not have been permitted to publish. His memoirs were published posthumously, decades after his death, when the political landscape had changed sufficiently to make their content less explosive. They take their place in the historical record alongside other accounts from Stalin's inner circle, including those of Khrushchev, Mikoyan, and various guards and household staff who eventually wrote or spoke about what they had seen. What do we learn from Nikolai Vlasik's story that we couldn't learn from the more prominent figures of the Stalin era? We learn something about the specific texture of life inside the security apparatus, the experience of the men who were neither the ideological leaders nor the terror's primary victims, but who occupied the middle space, implementing and maintaining the system, living within its logic, shaped by its requirements. Vlasik was not a political figure. He was not an ideologue. He was a security professional who spent his career doing a specific job, and what that job required him to see and know and carry gives his testimony a quality that is different from the testimony of politicians and generals. We learn something about the nature of loyalty in a system that demanded absolute loyalty while providing none. Vlasik's devotion to Stalin was by all available evidence genuine. He had spent 20 years in close proximity to this man, had organized his life, had taken seriously the responsibility of keeping him safe. And that loyalty, that genuine personal investment, provided him no protection when it became politically convenient to destroy him. We learn something about knowledge as liability. The most dangerous thing Vlasik possessed, more dangerous than any weapon, more dangerous than any political connection, was what he knew. 20 years of observation of Stalin in his most unguarded moments, knowledge of his physical condition, his psychological state, his relationships, his fears. This knowledge was an asset until it became a threat. When the political landscape shifted, when the people around Stalin began to manage the environment in ways that required Vlasik's removal, his knowledge became the reason to destroy him rather than the reason to protect him. And we learn something about the specific irony that attaches to the lives of people who devote themselves to protecting power. The protector is always less than the protected, always derivative, always contingent. The moment the protected no longer needs or wants protection, the protector has nothing. Vlasik's entire identity, his rank, his access, his purpose, everything that made his life meaningful in the terms that the Soviet system offered, depended entirely on his relationship to Stalin. When that relationship ended, not because Vlasik failed in any meaningful sense, but because political circumstances made his removal convenient, there was nothing underneath it. No independent identity, no alternative foundation, nothing. He had given 20 years to a man who, in the end, could not protect him, would not protect him, may have been manipulated into destroying him by the very people whose threat to Stalin Vlasik might have detected and resisted if he'd been allowed to remain in place. The protector was not protected. The loyal servant was not served. The man who had organized an entire apparatus to ensure that nothing happened to Stalin without his knowledge was removed from the picture just as the most consequential events of Stalin's final months were unfolding. That's the essence of Nikolai Vlasik's story. Not dramatic in the way of battlefield victories or show trial confessions. Quiet in the way that most human tragedies are quiet. A man did his job for 20 years, did it with genuine commitment and considerable competence, and was destroyed by the system he served with a bureaucratic efficiency that suggests the system barely noticed who he was. He noticed, though. He watched and he remembered and he wrote it down as faithfully as he could, the record of what it looked like from the closest possible distance to watch one man hold absolute power over 170 million people for 25 years. That record, imperfect and partial, and inevitably shaped by Vlasik's own perspective and limitations, is part of what we know about Stalin. Part of the evidence from which history constructs its understanding of what those years were and what they cost. The guard who spent 20 years watching everything, who was removed just before the end, who was not there for Stalin's final hours, left behind the testimony of those 20 years as the only thing the system could not take from him. He saw it. He remembered it. He wrote it down. In the Soviet Union, in the Stalin era, that was an act of remarkable persistence. Perhaps even, in its quiet way, an act of courage.